Good afternoon, all. If you can, please take your seats for the Witherspoon Lecture. Please come forward. We have plenty of seats in the front. And is the sound pretty good in the back? And those of you in the back hear well? Yes, I hear a thumbs up. Very good. Thank you. All right. Welcome, everyone, to this, there we go. I also don't know how to run a PC. To the Witherspoon Lecture. It is a pleasure to have all of you here. I do want to recognize, before we begin, the awards committee, both for this lecture series as well as all of our awards committee in the hydrologic sciences, in the hydrology section. They did an outstanding job this year. I also do want to recognize that this lecture is a relatively new lecture in the section, and this was developed by a relatively small group but very effective group of our members, roughly, I think it's about 5 or 6 years ago, and under President Effie Fafula Georgia. And so we really do appreciate this work. This is a great opportunity for a new lecture series, and we hope to do some more of these in the future. The plan for this afternoon is we'll have our citationist come up and introduce Patrick Reed, our Witherspoon Lecture. I just do want to mention or remind a little bit, or a little bit of a story. I did meet Paul Witherspoon. Some of you may not have. Many of you in the audience are a bit too young. He passed away some time ago. He was a very imposing man, meaning he was, and I'm short, so he was very large, and very impressive. But when you got to talk to him, he was very easy to talk to and a wonderful soul. So he is missed, and I think he will be looking down upon us here and enjoying this lecture as well as the rest of us. So without further ado, I would like to bring up on the stage the citationist for Patrick Reed today, Amir Agakuchek, and he will present the citation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Before I start, I should mention that Thorsten Wagner, Martin Clark, Pete Laux, and Greg Chiracalis were also involved in this nomination. It's a great honor to introduce Professor Patrick Reed from Cornell University, an exceptionally high-achieving mid-career scientist, as the recipient of this year's Paul Witherspoon Lecture Award. Pat is being recognized for his fundamental contributions to uncertainty and multi-objective optimization theories in hydrology and his unselfish cooperation in mentoring and research. Pat's research interests relate to sustainable water management given conflicting demands from renewable energy systems, ecosystem services, expanding populations, and climate change. His group has made pioneering contributions in several methodological areas, including multi-objective optimization, decision theory, stochastic control, and advanced visual analytics to support decision-making under uncertainty. His contributions have been recognized with several awards and honors, including the prestigious NSF Career Award and ASCE Hoover Research Prize. It is challenging to capture the full scope of Pat's contributions in 2-3 minutes that I have today. I will mention just some of his contributions. Pat has focused strongly on the feedbacks between hydrological observation networks, predictive modeling under uncertainty, and managing trade-offs that emerge from complex multi-actor conflicts in water resources systems. He has shown how coupled models of hydrology, water supply storage, and human demand can be exploited to formulate time dynamic assessment of risk of failure. His work shows how stochastic risk of failure rules can be exploited to better inform urban water system investments while hedging their vulnerability to longer-term human and climate risks. Pat has also extended stochastic robust control theory to encompass complex river basin scale conflicts across water, food, energy sectors, and also extreme floods and droughts. Pat's innovations have garnered applications and extensions from other research groups worldwide. Beyond traditional academic impact, Pat has broadly disseminated his computational innovations using several open source repositories as well as curated blog called Water Programming. His codes have more than 30,000 users in over 100 countries around the world. Pat has published over 100 peer-reviewed journal articles in the best technical journals in our field, including WRR and GRL, and also interdisciplinary journals like Nature Climate Change and Earth Future. He serves on numerous committees, including a Congressional Chartered Advisory Group under the Department of Energy. Pat also contributed to the 4th US Climate Assessment in the area of complex systems and interdependent risks. Lastly, Pat takes great care in mentoring and placement of his students. Just since 2013, he has placed 6 of his advisees in high-profile academic positions. Some of them are in this room now. For all of these reasons and many more, I am truly happy for Professor Patrick Reed for this very well-deserved recognition. Congratulations, Pat.
Congratulations. Get you set up.
So thank you all for coming out on a Thursday after what has been an eventful but taxing conference, I'm sure. I want to start with thanking Amir and my letter writers and the awards committee and the hydrology section and all of you for being here. I also want to specifically thank Christy, Arista, and Vienne, so my wife and daughters, who put up with my crazy schedule and tendency to get obsessed with things, where I disappear intellectually even when I'm in the room sometimes. And in terms of this particular lecture today, it's pretty surreal. So my undergraduate degree is in geological engineering, and if you have a degree in geological engineering, Paul Witherspoon basically founded that field. So he was everywhere at all time during that experience, whether it was in an energy focus of the subsurface, groundwater, rock mechanics, etc. It's amazing to actually be affiliated with a legacy of this level. There's also, just from my own personal sort of perspective, his first job after his master's degree was at the Illinois State Geological Survey. And while he was there, he decided to take advantage of Champaign-Urbana, which I also did for a PhD. And if you read his biography, his passion for academia was awakened on the Champaign-Urbana campus. And in that period of time, subsurface science was explosive on that campus. And then he transitioned to Berkeley. But I do want to focus on something that I think is even more incredible from a scientific perspective. So if you've been in really complex situations, those of you who really try to affect change in complex systems, something at the level of structural institutional change, there is nothing more fundamental than that in terms of a sign of incredible contribution. And he's the founding director of the Earth Science divisions of Lawrence Berkeley. And if you read this sort of letter, it's an incredible issue that shows a selflessness and a depth and a persistence, because this clearly hides an incredible amount of effort over that. The other interesting thing is that he transitioned in his career and focused in sort of risk in society, particularly thinking about nuclear waste, and that translational science, so setting a foundation for action. And that's going to be a theme in my talk as well. So I'll admit I'm addicted to hanging out with young folks. I love this job in this regard, and I just want to thank you those of you that are out in the room. I've had an amazing opportunity to mentor so many great people. And though I'm not calling you out by name, you've changed my life. That being said, also, I do want to call out by name Barbara Mensker, Alva Loki, and Dave Goldberg, who put up with me basically on the Illinois campus. I was a fairly difficult graduate student to manage. I did what I liked to do in that regard, and they always opened the doors for me. And while I'm not going to mention everybody on this, and I couldn't put pictures of everyone that I've collaborated with, I've learned a tremendous amount. Basically, collaboration has been a mechanism for me to be a forever student. I will keep that Peter Pan syndrome and continue collaborating. Moving to sort of more topical motivation. So this was earlier this year, the bomb cyclone in the Missouri River. And there's a quote here that is pretty issue, or a large issue. So along the Missouri, John Remus controls a network of dams that dictates the fate of millions, and it was not designed to handle this, is a quote for him. And I'm afraid that we're getting acclimated to this, and that sometimes we might be seduced into thinking that building models of these systems is actually legitimately informing action. And that's not the same thing in that regard. The other thing is, how does one actually hypothesize and move through different conceptions of a societal problem at this scale? What are the trade-offs across the demands? What's the role of human preference? What are the mechanisms of failure? How do we actually represent those in our models? How do we legitimately communicate that? How do we actually effectuate change? So what I would say is that if we're really thinking about using our models in this sort of context to capture risk and resilience, I think it represents a fundamental challenge to the basic mechanisms of science and philosophy of science itself. And related to that is this issue that you should hold yourself to being able to actually capture the real extremes to the extent that you can that are going to be confronted. That's difficult because you don't know what they're going to be in the future. But even more challenging is, can your models actually capture the failure modes that system are going to confront? On that, I would say that it is fundamental that human preference, trade-offs across demands, and having the ability to have high-fidelity representations of the actions that you might take in the models is a preeminent concern. We should be creating a mechanism of state action consequence exploration. There is a plurality of hypotheses that exist here. And unlike closed sort of science, where you have well-defined action and well-defined control, there is a plurality of possible futures that all are equally legitimate. And it comes down to values and trade-offs and sort of the societal perception of the risk itself. What I would say is this requires as a field that we shift towards thinking about human actions and their consequences within the context of hydrology, water resources, as a complex adaptive systems sort of approach. And I mean that in a more formal sense, and I'll get to that later. The other is thinking about the art of collaborative science. I'm a little bit nervous about false consensus and the substitution of perceived or self-declared expertise in the face of complexity in that regard. And so what I would say is, we should be very, very careful about how we scale our mechanisms to create and generate and evaluate hypotheses. So if you haven't read John Dewey, I would suggest reading John Dewey. He was a pragmatic science philosopher, and he actually advocated for moving from a closed system to an open systems perspective and a collaborative perspective on science. And one of the questions that I often ask my students are, do your hypotheses define your workflow, or does your workflow define the scope of your hypotheses? Because one of those is right. And I find that we substitute comfort for appropriate more often than not. And if we think about a complex system, you want to exponentially scale your capability to address that system. Now, what I'm showing here in the image that I have here, which is interesting, this is the actual developer influence diagram in the form of a city or urban scape of Stack Overflow. So the higher the building, that's actually a developer that's having a stronger network effect. What does this look like in hydrology? What should it look like? How should we be connecting? So I've been listening to a lot of meetings, and I think there's a tremendous amount that we can gain from FAIR principles. So making sure our software and our tools are findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. That creates a mechanism for replicability. It doesn't guarantee it. And that adds credibility. But credibility is also a seductive bit of a lie. Credibility doesn't affect change in society. You need relevance and you need legitimacy. You need to connect to the individuals who actually have to make that, and you have to build sort of the trust to be able to effectuate the actual insights that could potentially transform what the system needs. This is a very old thing. I've enjoyed listening to various perspectives on artificial intelligence. I actually started in the area when it was basically sort of a negative in the 90s. And one of the founders of artificial intelligence is Herbert Simon. And if you haven't read the book, The Sciences of the Artificial, this is the emergence of his insights after the sort of cybernetics and economics and computation. So when computers were born, he gave a very, very clear vision how adaptive feedback and computers and software and sensors and all of this could help solve society's problems, which in 1961 is a pretty bold statement. And you have sort of the emergence of systems thinking. One of the things that I'd like to clarify is that when you're thinking about artificial intelligence, don't substitute machine learning as artificial intelligence, because it is a subset of a very large suite of fields. So what you're seeing here is a taxonomy of artificial intelligence. And on the bottom axis is sort of the methodological base. And so Herbert Simon was on the sort of descriptive logic component. And this moves all the way to the right towards search and optimization. And on the vertical axis is the contextual use of those tools, where it moves from sort of simple sensing and feedback sort of perception, moving up to more ambitious cognitive processes such as planning and communications. I happen to have been working for 2 decades in evolutionary computation. So my mentor was David Goldberg in this area, and his mentor was John Holland, who invented genetic algorithms at the University of Michigan. David Goldberg popularized genetic algorithms with a book in 1989. If you like things like citation, that book is going to have about 90,000 citations by the end of this year. And in this case, one of the things that attracted me to the idea as a civil engineer to really dive deep into the algorithm is that I was greedily wanting access specifically to simulation optimization with Monte Carlo simulation techniques. I wanted to account for uncertainty, and I wanted to search for candidate action with that. And that's incredibly difficult. These were noise tolerant. That was known in the 90s. In his book and in his early work, he highlighted the idea that you could do this for multiple objectives. And if you do anything with water, it's clear that multiple objectives are going to be there. This gives you a sense of sort of what we're talking about. So you have a 3-objective surface. The triangle is the analytical known. Red is the algorithm finding that known. What's different about this is you're searching through the space, but then you have to diversify across the manifold. And so this is very different than sort of classical optimization techniques. And each of those red particles moves. That's actually, in our context, Monte Carlo simulation. There's a nuance here too. It's easy to argue over the abstract. This is a mechanism where you can actually transform perception and preference into explicit trade-off. You can't improve one thing without degrading another. So some of you know me for the nerd that I am. So the algorithm that I'm probably best known for is Borg MOEA. If you don't watch Star Trek Generation 2, that's the best villain in that regard. But they have a philosophy. They strive for perfection and they will assimilate. What's interesting about this particular algorithm is it's a hyper-heuristic. It's actually not a single algorithm. It is a self-adaptive, internally consistent strategy for generating algorithms that learn the topological features of the space as it solves it in a competition. And what I'm showing you is a generalization of this in a parallel context. So now you have an ecosystem of self-adaptive searchers that are augmenting each other, learning from each other, and exploring. Why would one do this if you're a water resources engineer or hydrologist? Because I wanted access to hypotheses I couldn't get to. I wanted to be able to solve problems that at the time were not tractable. And one of the interesting things in this, if you do the algorithmic design, Actually, even if you ran on the same number of cores, a non-adaptive, non-cooperative version of this algorithm, say 1024 core, and then you run this interactive cooperative group, you actually get superlinear speed up, a factor of 10 to 20. What does that mean? Now your 10,000 or your 1024 is acting like 10,000. One of the things in terms of access to hypothesis that I've paid attention to is changing the workflow towards the architectures that emerge. So scaling the question to the availability of hero class computing has been one aspect of sort of our work. Asking questions that are at the boundary of what's tractable. So in this particular case, one of the things about having an algorithm this difficult in terms of all of its complexity and its ability to adapt and configure it is how do you actually put it on a system that has 500,000 or 1 million core? There's lots of ways you could do that. We actually had to build a discrete event simulation of the algorithm itself, where we could predict how it would perform on the architecture before we ran it on the architecture, and then we could predict the speed up. So what you see here is that we have high accuracy, and this is when we were doing work using the University of Illinois' Blue Waters to design global observation systems. But one of the interesting things here is that we have the capability to scale this to the exascale. To put that in something a little more concrete, we can do millennia of serial work in a day. So this creates a mechanism to explore a tremendous amount and to look at the candidate action space and explore extremely difficult stochastic multi-objective problems. Sounds great. I was excited at the time. But what does it mean when you expand the capability to formulate extremely difficult problems? You start reading about the philosophy of formulating problems. Because the question then is, are you solving the right problem? And then who actually defines the problem? And this is actually very interesting. So the mathematician, Horst Rittel, he wrote a critique of Herbert Simon's Sciences of the Artificial. And he said, slow down there. You're not going to solve all of society's problems with this automatic technological feedback system because there's a lot of complexities. And let me know if this sounds like any problems you've heard of. Social systems problems are ill-formulated. Information is confusing many clients. Decision makers with conflicting values, ramifications, and the whole system are thoroughly confusing. He actually formalized this. This is an interesting thing. The first instance of his critique was from a meeting, and it was summarized by a different author. He formalized it in a later paper. And what he highlighted is sort of this general sort of suite of traits that make it very difficult and fundamentally challenge sort of classical science itself. I'm not going to go through all of these, but these are actually traits that are pretty common actually within hydrology and water resource systems, particularly when you start thinking about transforming from state to action to consequence in that regard. There's a few of these things just to highlight. The planner has no right to be wrong. So it basically means that falsification is a dangerous game. You don't want to falsify yourself accidentally by recommending an action that proves to be very wrong in that regard. You have a tremendous amount of irreversibility. If you want to think about this more modern sorts of context, there are modern philosophers like Revetz or Funowitz, and they talk about post-normal science. So normal science was actually sort of early philosophy, Kuhn's reference. So he distinguished sort of scientific revolution from incremental science. But a lot of what Kuhn's was talking about was fairly well-defined problems where you had a lot of control. The post-normal science focus, or other sorts of areas like decision-making under deep uncertainty, now you're starting to talk about societal problems where there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty, there's conflicting values, and there is a criticality to action. And so the question is, how do you go into this, and how do you create sort of the framing and exploration approach? There's also another component to this, and there's actually been some talks throughout the conference here. It moves from being able to be a single actor scientist to have to really think about co-production, adaptivity in complex systems, social context, networks, and interaction. And there's a lot of this that you see at actually AGU in the session. A lot of these topics that are classically complex systems, which I would say the curriculum at Santa Fe represents the most formalized version of what complex systems is, are actually in a lot of our papers in that regard. One of the things that is still sort of emerging is our ability to be relevant and legitimate in the process of exercising that science. If we want to be mathematical, do we actually have strong causality? If you make a small error in your model, does that actually mean a small error in the world, or is it a multiplicative amplifying effect that misrepresents preference and takes you off a cliff? And this connects to things like complex systems and socio-ecological systems, the ability to think about tipping points, irreversibility. So we make a lot of assumptions, and it's reasonable in some sense, but a lot of the assumptions we make assume decomposability in systems that we actually don't know the interdependency in. And sort of to lead this, you have this sort of in-between. There's Simon's vision of this sort of cyber future of feedback and technology resolves societal problems, and then Riddle's, which is sort of bleak in terms of can you really solve societal problems? And one of the things that I sort of ask is where are we at now and where is this going sort of into the future? So what I want to do is I want to use two sort of examples, and I'll narrate sort of some of these themes and then the results themselves in terms of some of the lessons that we've been learning and the approaches that we've been implementing in real systems. So the first will be the Red River in Vietnam, a flooding hydropower agriculture, and you can think of this as a race between rule systems. So how many of our models represent sort of infrastructure through an if-then-else sort of decomposition of rules? A lot, if not all. Likewise, in this particular case, you have that if-then-else, which are actually operationalizing in the system. So that's an operational case, but it's not structurally changing the system. A different context and example that I'll show is what if you actually have 4 different jurisdictions that actually want to cooperate, but the state of the system in terms of its capacity to serve is actually evolving as you're also trying to change its management through a cooperative group that may or may not cooperate. So these are the 2 examples that I'll talk through. So we'll start with the Red River. I want to acknowledge my collaborators. So this was done by my former advisee, Julie Quinn, who's now a junior faculty at University of Virginia. And Julie and I were fortunate enough to be able to join up with Matteo Giuliani and Andrea Castelletti as part of their ongoing sort of project in the Red River. And I do want to highlight here, just in terms of achievements, Matteo and Andrea were actually honored for this project by the European Commission out of hundreds of projects for responsible research and innovation in the system. So the Red River context, so in this particular case, it's the second largest river in Vietnam, and of central sort of focus for this project is the flood risk in Hanoi. And so basin-wide, you average about $130 million in damages from potential flood risk and $50 million in Hanoi itself. So this flood risk motivated the development of storages. So you have the storages Hoi Bin, Son La, Thác Ba, and Chun King. And it's to preserve or to protect Hanoi, largely, as the primary driver. But if you develop large storages, there are other things, obviously, to be used for. So one of the questions is, how do you actually, when you've made this large capital investment, coordinate that investment to maximally achieve what your objectives are? So in this particular system, dams provide 46% of Vietnam's installed electrical capacity, and agriculture is 70% of the population's employment, and represents, so 76% of that agriculture is irrigated. And this is, if I'm not mistaken, the 3rd largest rice production zone in Asia. So in this system, you have a control diagram where you have 5 rivers, and then you have 4 storage control points. You're thinking about releases, and then shown in red is you have a levee level in Hanoi that you want to stay below. So in this particular case, in working pretty amazingly with Matteo and Andrea, Julie and I were able to actually get approximately 1,000-line code for what the actual operational rules are for the system. So this becomes a hypothesis test. Just to show sort of graphically what the sort of assumption processes are in this particular representation is that you have sort of a decomposition between flood, dry season, and then discretion. And in each of these cases, they decompose the rule system to look at each storage and each season. And then you have releases that you're considering, and in their rule system, they make those releases functional in terms of what time it is, storages in the other reservoirs, and then a 48 relatively naive but effective forecast in terms of what's the risk at the levee at Hanoi. So you can see that you move through the reservoirs, sort of the decomposition one at a time in the flood season. Likewise, you switch over in terms of the dry season, in terms of minimum release or store. So it's nothing particularly shocking in this particular case. You go through each of the reservoirs. It gets a little more complicated in terms of Hoi Bin and Son La because they have to do specific sort of pulse flooding for rice later in the season, and Son La has to iterate a bit with Hoi Bin to regulate its overall levels. One of the interesting things here is if you want to evaluate this, there's discretion in this as well. So how does one actually represent discretion? So we have this sort of rule system, and in this rule system, their intent is to maximize hydropower production, minimize water supply deficit, and minimize flooding at Hanoi. So how should we translate these particular goals into our models? Now we are putting an alternate hypothesis. So you think of this as an alternate set of rule systems. So we change to a continuous space, and this is an abstraction from stochastic control. In this particular case, what if we actually use a continuous representation of what the control rules could be, and then we parameterize those, we can simulate performance, and then we can search to get the trade-offs from an alternate set of rules. If we have this sort of rule form, what we can see is that we have releases here where you have a different form of the function, but it's very much the same idea. Your outputs are your releases at your reservoir. Your inputs are the same inputs as the Vietnam guide curve. And what you have here in the sine and cosine is just maintaining continuity across your annual policy. But what you're actually searching with the algorithm is the structure and form of this multivariate policy for release. And so what you end up having is when you have the certain inputs, they map to outputs in terms of performance. So now we have two hypotheses, the control rules and then an alternate space of searching the potential stochastic rules. So how do they compare? So if we think about this, you have flood and you have hydro, and you have your ideal at the top. What you would like to be is a large blue dot at that star. So what we ended up doing is you get a sense of sort of the trade-off with the control rules that we formulated. And then we use these to actually simulate what the performance of their actual control rule is. One of the things that you see is that they're actually inadvertently, regardless of how well that we represent it, potentially increasing risk at Hanoi. So this is at the level of potential breach. And this is something recognized in the system. So if we think about this, we can look at different sorts of preferences: flood, cooperation or compromise, hydropower maximization, and a guideline solution. If we compare this over 100,000 different sorts of realizations, the lower bottom line is nuisance flooding. The larger dash line is their freeboard where they don't want to go, and the solid line is breach. And what you see here in red is the log probability. So in the state space, when you're at a given storage, potentially what is the most likely level in Hanoi? One of the things that you see here, just to emphasize, is that for a relatively uncoordinated amount of your storage on the guideline policy is that you actually see the if-then-else structure, the nonlinear threshold, an inadvertent sort of increasing in risk. And you also have a higher residual of potential breach risk. So one of the things that's interesting about this is answering the question, why? Why is this occurring? So in this particular case, since we have actually an analytic form of alternative potential ways of formulating the rules, we can actually take that policy that we parameterized and we can actually do the variance decomposition across a stochastic set of inflows. And what you're in essence doing is looking for the sensitivity of every action for every input in this particular case. We actually, in this particular, we have everything we need. We have the covariance between the inflows. We have the potential to do first order effects, second order effects, and we neglect higher order effects. The other thing that's sort of unique is because the actions can be anti-correlated is that you can actually consider that you have negative impacts. And in this particular case, just to illustrate that briefly, if you have positive covariance and then your sensitivity to your input is in different directions, so basically your two different sources of information, say increase or decrease flows, you can get a negative interaction. Likewise, if you have a negative correlation but positive sort of interactions between information. But get to the real solid component of this. This means at any given point, we can look for, as a function of preference, how that particular point is affected by the piece of information that goes into it. In this case, we look at the hydro policy. And what you can see in this particular case is the percent of variance is strongly dominated initially by Huygens storage. But in this particular policy, we're maximizing hydropower. And in this particular case, we use a smaller reservoir, which is shown in green, to actually manage the overall sort of variability in the system. Now, this is for a worst case 100-year flood. What if we had sort of worst case 100-year deficits in hydropower, or worst case 100-year deficits in agricultural water supply? You actually get totally different information structures, and that changes. What if we actually change that for the best flood policy? The best flood policy, so now it's the same events, we've just changed preference in terms of which policy. You get a fundamentally different information signature across the system. Likewise, what if we want to compromise? Compromise actually becomes more complex, and you start to get an interaction with your forecast. So one of the things about this, at any given period, any piece of information is subject to what preference is driving choice. This is what the guideline curves look like. Just to highlight briefly, when you're trying to do control based on information, when you get no signal from the information, that's not ideal in that regard. And then you're only dominated by a primary storage. So in this particular case, what I'm highlighting here and getting back to sort of the philosophy of framing, one of the unique things is we had two different forms of the same sort of potential abstraction of control. We mapped that through preference, and what you can see is the inadvertent consequences of the way that that was represented. And just to go through this is also relevant to the way we abstract reservoir systems in our models, not just for real systems control. And if you have these poor abstractions, they do not capture sort of the risk and the resilience of the system. The other caveat is actually small changes in institutions and shifts could fundamentally shift the way that we are interpreting the results I just showed you. So I want to shift here to a slightly different example here. So in this case, what's different is that you have 4 cities basically coordinating that have water supply drought risk. And what's different versus a control problem is they're actually wanting to expand their capacity for water supply, the planning problem, and they want to manage their systems individually and collectively. This particular case, I want to acknowledge my PhD students, David Gold and Bernardo Trindade, and collaborators Greg Charoklis and Harrison Zeff at UNC Chapel Hill. So in this case, what you have is you have a differential of 4 cities. And for Awassa, you can substitute basically Chapel Hill. There's a difference in sort of the demands to supply ratio, And in this particular case, and you see in the map, these are different candidate infrastructure investments that they could make individually or collectively. And in terms of this particular case, is can you actually increase mechanisms of cooperation to improve the whole regional's risk profile while individually satisfying performance for the actors? And the two mechanisms for coordination in terms of actions, treated transfers from the Jordan Lake. So Cary actually has a water treatment plant where they can actually transfer to the other utilities, temporary transfer. And then the other thing that's being discussed is joint investment. So you create sort of joint ownership and reducing the overall capital intensity of their sort of investment pathway. Now, one of the things about this, talking about models, how many models actually allow you to accurately represent that you could have stochastic sort of hydroclimatic, human demand, construction delay, what if people don't respond to restriction? There are none. We had to write it. What was the likelihood that they modeled each other? They didn't. What was the likelihood that the reliability side of each utility actually modeled with the financial side? They didn't. So the hypothesis that you can reach here was a function of having to literally rewrite the entire sort of model. How does that have any legitimacy? We had to work collaboratively over years. We had to meet their expectations of performance and then introduce this idea that they have so many fundamental uncertainties that they even need the permission to look at the uncertainties. And that goes all the way up to the water board, mayor level, etc. So one of the things that we're doing in this is sort of bridging the planning and management problem. It's something that you should be able to understand pretty easily. If you do a lot of smart things in the short term, that actually sets optionality up in the long term. The smart things we're trying to help them do for each individual is restriction triggers, so a rule form, transfer triggers, so a reserve fund for financial, so self-insurance, and then maybe a third-party transfer, because one of the things is if you're restricting your potential users and you're buying water, that creates a disincentive for conservation itself. So there's a financial side to this issue. And one of the things that we're doing this is it's a race between supply capacity and demand. And what the triggers are is how close you get to 20% of storage remaining in the system, and that's the definition of failure. We can do this for short-term risk in terms of those temporary transfers and the financial instruments, and you can do this risk of failure dynamic for the long term in terms of the prioritization of different projects for infrastructure investment and when you're going to trigger those particular investments. This creates a single, complex, but tractable mechanism where you can actually look at the full pathways. Just to sort of illustrate what this looks like, this is hypothetical system. You start with the status quo. We have a policy over on the right that defines sort of our actions. That policy defines our risk triggers. And so you start off with the status quo. This is going to be our pathway. You look at the long-term risk of failure, and this is your decision. When do you trigger? And when you cross that, you're going to actually trigger new infrastructure. Likewise, you're tracking your total storage. And you have your short-term risk of failure. And this is the trigger for your short-term actions. So every single action has its own trigger for every actor, which is fairly high-dimensional, but reducing it to a risk of failure formulation makes it fundamentally less of a high-dimensional and intractable problem compared to sort of classical formulation. And it also opens up the door for stochastic adaptivity. So if you increase the demands and you cross your long-term risk of failure, you don't immediately get the capacity. So then this is another mathematical sort of complication, is accounting for the delay in the potential capacity. Then you trigger that. That's a threshold, a high nonlinear threshold in the system. You reset your states, all of your risk of failures drop, and then you're back into the race with your capacity. This continues through the sequence. This is one instance of one pathway for one potential trace. So that's one potential trace. Maybe you have another pathway for more severe conditions where you have more potential infrastructure investment. Maybe you have more favorable where you delay. If we look at 1,000 different traces of what the future is, then what you can end up having is actually a realization of how all these pathways vary for this particular policy for 1,000 worlds. And what you can see is there's sort of a consistent timing in the way that this is done, but we didn't pre-specify it. Now, what if we wanted a less risk-averse policy? We might change our rule system and delay investment. Or maybe this is what they're doing and you want to contrast that. So in this particular case, what the hard problem was how do you set the thresholds for every individual for every action across the system when every action actually is interdependently affecting every other individual? And so this is a large stochastic search where we were sampling 1,000 worlds. We were looking at reliability, restriction frequency, the cost of the capital, worst case volatile cost, and allocation of Jordan Lake in this 5 objectives. But one of the things that you want to do in this is that you're probably not going to live in the world that you just sampled. Even though you did 1,000 worlds, the likelihood that you actually captured the future is largely 0. So what we ended up doing is then do a verification. After you get the trade-offs, we put those trade-offs in 2 million other worlds. And then in those 2 million other worlds, what you want to count is what is acceptable or what is unacceptable. And as you're thinking about that, that's the fraction of sampled states that sort of satisfy. Who specifies this? This is a component of co-production. We actually had to have conversations, sitting around the table, thinking about conceptions and iterating. And obviously, I'm giving you a very condensed form of a long multi-year sort of discussion. This is actually what they wanted across all their performance. And if you take this and you do the count and you do the reevaluation, you actually can get a sense of what % of the worlds that you've sampled where they're actually meeting their required performance. So 100% would be ideal. A parallel axis plot, you have each of the actors on each of your vertical axes, so Owasso, Durham, Raleigh, and each line represents one potential policy for the whole system. And diagonal on this line means I do good, you do not. A direct trade-off between performance. I make my system more robust, your system loses robustness. So you have a multi-actor trade-off. So one of the questions is, you have a very large individual. Raleigh's the capital. They have the largest population center, and they have the largest economy. And it turns out that making Raleigh better makes a lot of others not better. How does one actually, so in a lot of our work, we can do visual interaction and look through these, but just for the sake of the talk, let's think about different logics of how we'd actually select a solution and look at the consequences. So one of the possibilities is we could do a social planning. What if we did a least squares regression where we minimize sort of regret for everybody, that everybody is at their highest level relative to what's possible? If we do this sort of least squares compromise, what you get is actually this solution. It's not perfect for everybody, but it moves up. And what you're actually doing is navigating multi-actor, actually robustness conflict. So literal conflict within the system, although it might not be transparent. There's an alternate way that we could think about this problem and thinking about regional stability. So why would Raleigh play nice? Would be a way that we could ask the question in a different way. What if they don't want to compromise? In a way that you can abstract this, and it's not to say it's the only way, but it's a nice illustrative way to think about how these compromises are navigated, is that you can actually weight by power an individual in this regard. They have a higher population, they have a higher sort of level of poverty within their city. Changes in their water supply could arguably be made as being more sort of welfare important. And just based off the literature, one of the things that you can do with this is we could just choose the policy that minimizes sort of the normalized variance of satisfaction across the users. So, and if you weight by Raleigh's power, no surprise, it goes straight to maximizing Raleigh. And so now what we have is sort of this social planner and power index. And it's not to say that these are the solutions that they would pick, but I can tell you from real experience, I actually talked to a philosopher to discuss how you actually present this mapping in the real world, because there are implications in terms of showing transparently sort of asymmetries in power. Now, if we think about this, there are a tremendous number of deep uncertainties, but what I haven't said is what they're most exposed to and why. And so one of the things I've noticed in a lot of the sessions, it's a lot about focused on machine learning and states. But if you do large-scale, highly multivariate, stochastic sort of simulations, there's an entire beautiful space there for classification. And so one of the things that we can do is take these two different policies, which represent all the rules, consistent rules for every actor, for every instrument, in every time period, across weekly concerns all the way up through decadal. And then we can look at how those robustness trade-offs manifest in the uncertainty space. And then think about what are the factors that actually drive, and how different are the solutions themselves in terms of acceptability and consequence. So what we ended up using is we actually used boosted trees. And the reason we used boosted trees is because when you actually have capacity expansion, that's a horrifying nonlinear threshold, you need nonlinear, non-separable threshold classification. And without going into that in a lot of detail, what's more interesting is just how different the social planner and the power index solutions are relative to each other in this particular case. And what you're looking at is the bottom axis is the variable that was most potent in terms of controlling their success. And then on the vertical axis is the second rank variable. So in this particular case, you can see that both solutions, demand growth rate, which has been actually the case in almost every system I've ever analyzed, the human component and the demand growth and the dynamics of that are the dominant factor in terms of what failures are going to occur. If we look at the social planner solution, the fact that you get this sort of vertical alignment of red zones of failure says that basically the demand growth rate is the story. That's what's controlling failure. Now, if you move over to the power index, which favors Raleigh, that's less true. And the other thing that you have specifically here is look at the social planner, the amount of failure space that Raleigh has. And then if you move to that, to the Raleigh favoring power index, you swap out that failure surface and you pass it off to Durham and Carey. And actually, not only do you pass it off, you sensitize Carey to climate change. You change what factors that one of the actors is actually sensitive to, depending on how you navigate the particular trade-off and their interests. A few things to just highlight here. There was no model in place when we started this conversation that made any of this possible. You couldn't even ask the question. We couldn't sample the space. We couldn't relate the actions. We couldn't search. And we had no mechanism to test the hypotheses. And so it took approximately a decade of effort of working closely and collaboratively to create a both relevant and legitimate relationship for individuals to listen and to think about this. And if you think about what level of trust is required to get 18 years of their financial data, that's pretty high. So this shift between actors and shifting what the actors are sensitive to has a pretty broad implication. And I think this is likely more often than not true. So in this particular case, we're putting them on a sort of consistent rule system, both for their crisis short-term work and their planning. The exploratory modeling that I'm showing you gives you a sense, an experimentation. So what I said at the beginning, state, action, consequence, exploration, this is what I was talking about, but then mapping this through to preference and trade-off across actors and across demands. And then thinking about scenario discovery and new problem-solving techniques and thinking about deep uncertainty and things along this line actually fundamentally change sort of the mechanism and philosophy behind the why you're formulating and doing your particular science. So just to sort of wrap up, what I've shown you are sort of a couple of different, relatively simple, straightforward, in terms of the complexity of the systems that are out there, examples of mapping risk and resilience, where we tried to be careful about capturing extremes and real failure modes and really capturing sort of trade-offs, demands, and candidate actions And so you get this exploratory approach where you can think about state action and consequence feedbacks. I just want to leave here real quick with this idea of complex adaptive systems. I don't think it's controversial to state that humans are fundamentally one of the largest drivers in every system. And writing a PDE for the human, I haven't seen that successfully done yet in that regard. Thinking about how complex the different interactions are for them, I would say we have to exponentially scale the number of hypotheses and the approaches that we follow to think about these systems, because it's not going to be super clear. It's not a predict and then have direct knowledge sort of situation. And I see a few particularly targeted, but junior researchers out there that are in the audience. So this is addressed to you. Particularly, I'm making eye contact to sort of center, but in general. I'll give you a few things that I would suggest. One, be bold. You have an advantage. You're more familiar and see sort of the emergent tools, and you can see the problems that aren't being solved, because most visions today are based on the problems that are being solved. So number two is advocate for each other and build networks and amplify and diversify the voices that are allowed to participate in the process of the science as well as the hypothesis testing. Three, be empathetic. So if you are just trying to get a publication and you're working in a real system where there's real lived-in experiences, that's not actually an appropriate approach. You should put yourself into the context of the lived-in experiences of the recommendations that you're making. And then number four would be, if you're really interested in this and you really want legitimate and translational action in systems, then you need to get yourself ready to speak truth to power. Because one thing that we can predict very easily, humans don't like to change. And major structural change is scary. And you're going to encounter entrenched interest. And this gets to sort of the workflow issue. You need to have traceability, provenance, inclusivity, and transparency in your work. So with that, I would say that a lot of those recommendations, I would hope, resonate and would be endorsed by Paul Witherspoon himself. And with that, I thank you.